I'm Peter Ronay, and I'm here to introduce our speaker this morning. Hurricanes, floods, wildfires, retreating glaciers, melting polar ice, rising sea levels. We heard a little bit about that this morning. So this is an appropriate time to talk about climate change and attitudes for climate change. First, some statistics I think you might find interesting. Although 97% of climate scientists feel that there is convincing evidence for global warming that's human-produced, only 48%, that's less than half of US citizens, believe that global warming is real. The figure for Liberal Democrats is 79%, and for Conservative Republicans, 15%. That's 15%. Professor Wendy Peterson-Boring from Willamette's History Department grew up in the Willamette Valley, where she says she has found an unbelievable sense of place. I didn't grow up in the Willamette Valley, but I feel the same way. She has a BA in History from Willamette, a Master of Arts in Religious Studies from Yale Divinity School, and a PhD in History from Yale. Since 2006, she's been on the faculty at Willamette. She approaches climate change and climate change attitudes from a historical perspective. Her talk today is entitled Western Civilization and Sustainability, Reflections on Cross-Pollinating the Humanities and Environmental Science. We in ICL are old enough to approach life from a historical perspective, so please give Professor Wendy Peterson-Boring a warm welcome.
Thank you, Peter, for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to speak with you. Your group has a terrific reputation on campus for being inquisitive and energetic and offering a warm welcome, so it's a privilege for me to be invited to speak. What I hope we get to do the next hour together is to think together about what it means to be human in a time of climate change, and particularly at a time of human beings ushering in a new geological epoch, the Anthropocene or the Anthropocene. Either way works. So as a way to think together about this, I have pulled together some reflections on a course I teach at Willamette, and I have taught for the last 7 years, that is called Western Civ and Sustainability. I think it's the only course that has an oxymoron in the title that's on the books. It's a somewhat unusual course, and so I've used that as a point of departure to get us to think about a series of things about what it means to be human in this age. I first started teaching the course, I was hired to teach Western Civ. How many people took Western Civ in college? See, this is what's great about this audience. Because my students are like, what? How many, out of curiosity, how many people took Global Civ instead? See, it's a good generation here. So when I was hired to teach Western Civ a while ago, Willamette, out of PhD program, I taught it once, and it was fine. And but I increasingly, this is right about the time that Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth had come out. And I was increasingly spending time in my office hours with students who were deeply concerned about environmental problems, and particularly climate change. And their questions to me as the historian was, how did we get here? Like, how did this happen? And I went to prep my Western Civ for the next time I was going to teach it, and I realized that the textbook that I was using really did not address that question at all. And standard Western civ textbooks really aren't built to address questions of environmental destruction, how we got here. They increasingly are able to take into account questions of social inequity and race, colonialism. They also increasingly include women. So they're able to include what I would call feminist and post-colonial critiques, but they really don't include much environmental history. Nature is seen as sort of this passive backdrop against which the real drama of what it means to be human takes place. And very little in them does that. So I set out to try to develop an entirely different kind of course. And my efforts can be seen in part of what is a somewhat new field of the environmental humanities. For about the last 7 to 10 years, this field has grown. There are now PhD and master's programs, there are journals, there are conferences. And the environmental humanities are responding to the sense of urgency around environmental problems by talking about the ways that humanities disciplines, history, philosophy, religious studies, for instance, can actually speak to our problems today and make sense of them in ways that the sciences can't, or even the social sciences can't. And they, particularly the environmental humanities as a whole, are responding to the need for new stories, new aesthetic expressions, and new ways of conceiving of what it means to be human given the environmental destruction that we're experiencing. They are also particularly interested in how the humanities as disciplines can provide entrance in for students to address what E.F. Schumacher has called divergent problems. And he, as an educator who talked about convergent problems as those problems that we can solve through reason and logic and linear processes, and convergent problems as those problems that cannot be solved by that, but instead revolve or arise out of competing desires and interests, and must be addressed through what he termed, he called them the higher pathways of wisdom and literature and art. And so a lot of what I've done can be sort of housed in this larger framework of the environmental humanities. And when I developed the course, the guiding questions for it were, what does it mean to possess historical consciousness in an age of climate change? What can we learn from our past that might help guide our future? And how can the study of history contribute to students' desire and ability to move towards more sustainable ways of living? And as you can tell from those questions, my sense is that students didn't want just straight environmental history. They didn't want just what happened, but they really want what can we do about it. So my class is a blend of many things. It draws on geology and climate science and environmental science, history, philosophy, a great book curriculum, and also the literature of environmental ethics and activism. So every day we are asking not only what have we learned, but what can we do about it? And it's very much focused on forming what I like to call aptitude for action. I've written about this course and published it in the Journal of Environmental History. I also published a chapter about it in a book I edited. The book is called Teaching Sustainability: Perspectives from the Humanities and Social Sciences. But let me just go back. But today, I'm going to do something a little bit different than what I've usually done and help us just sort of think through some things. So, as you probably know, human civilization has been able to thrive within the context of climate stability during the era of the Holocene. And do I have a pointer here? No, I don't. Whoops. I do. Is it down here? Where is it? The round dot. There it is. Right there. The last 10,000 years of climate stability are referred to the Holocene era. And as you can tell, relative to the time period before the Holocene, we've experienced in the last 10,000 years an immense amount of climate stability and also warmth. The Holocene has provided, the climate stability and warmth of the Holocene has provided the safe operating space within which human civilization has been able to thrive. The introduction of the term I use, which I'll get up here in a minute, but the Anthropocene, is a term that has been used. It was first coined by Paul Crutzen, who's a chemist, about 12 years ago. He published an article on it in Nature magazine in 2002, and he was reportedly sitting at a conference with a bunch of geologists talking about the Holocene, and he kind of erupted and said, we should stop talking about the Holocene. The Holocene is over. What we have is the Anthropocene, or the Anthropocene, a human-created epoch in which human activities have inserted themselves so decisively into every aspect of every planetary system that we have ushered in a new geological epoch. One of the primary ways we've done this, I'll talk about this more in a minute, is through raising temperatures through CO2 emissions. And a lot of what the Paris Agreement is about is trying to keep us within the safe operating zone that has been present in the Holocene and within the rise of the 2 degrees Celsius. Do you think it's going to let me click on this? Let me see here. I'd like to show you a video. How many people have seen this already? Nobody. So let's do this. Can you help me get that started? If you click the link, it should do it, and if not, I can get it pretty quickly. There we go.
Visualization is right at the heart of my own work too. I teach global health. And I know having the data is not enough. I have to show it in ways people both enjoy and understand. Now, I'm going to try something I've never done before. Animating the data in real space, with a bit of technical assistance from the crew.
So, here we go. First, an axis for health. Life expectancy, from 25 years to 75 years. And down here, an axis for wealth, income per person, $400,000, $4,000, and $40,000. So down here is poor and sick, and up here is rich and healthy. Now, I'm going to show you the world 200 years ago, in 1810. Here come all the countries. Europe brown, Asia red, Middle East green, Africa south of Sahara blue, and the Americas yellow. And the size of the country bubble showed the size of the population. And in 1810, it was pretty crowded down there, wasn't it? All countries were sick and poor. Life expectancy were below 40 in all countries. And only UK and the Netherlands were slightly better off, but not much. And now, why start the world? The Industrial Revolution makes countries in Europe and elsewhere move away from the rest. But the colonized countries in Asia and Africa, they are stuck down there. And eventually, the Western countries get healthier and healthier. And now we slow down to show the impact of the First World War and the Spanish flu epidemic. What a catastrophe! And now I speed up through the 1920s and the 1930s. And in spite of the Great Depression, Western countries forge on towards greater wealth and health. Japan and some others try to follow, but most countries stay down here. Now, after the tragedies of the Second World War, we stop a bit to look at the world in 1948. 1948 was a great year. The war was over, Sweden topped the medal table at the Winter Olympics, and I was born. But the differences between the countries of the world was wider than ever. United States was in the front, Japan was catching up, Brazil was way behind, Iran was getting a little richer from oil, but still had short lives. And the Asian giants, China, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Indonesia, they were still poor and sick down here. But look what is about to happen. Here we go again. In my lifetime, former colonies gained independence, and then finally they started to get healthier and healthier and healthier. And in the 1970s, then countries in Asia and Latin America started to catch up with the Western countries. They became the emerging economies. Some in Africa follows. Some Africans were stuck in civil war and others hit by HIV. And now we can see the world today in the most up-to-date statistics. Most people today live in the middle, but there are huge differences at the same time between the best of countries and the worst of countries. And there are also huge inequalities within countries. These bubbles show country averages, but I can split them. Take China, I can split it into provinces. There goes Shanghai. It has the same wealth and health as Italy today. And there is the poor inland province Guizhou. It is like Pakistan. And if I split it further, the rural parts are like Ghana in Africa.
And yet, despite the enormous disparities today, we have seen 200 years of remarkable progress. That huge historical gap between the West and the rest is now closing. We have become an entirely new converging world. And I see a clear trend into the future. With aid, trade, green technology and peace, it's fully possible that everyone can make it to the healthy, wealthy corner.
Well, what you just seen in the last few minutes is a story of 200 countries shown over 200 years and beyond. It involved plotting of 120,000 numbers. Pretty neat, huh?
He's very enthusiastic, isn't he?
So an overview would be like this. In the past,
Sorry, he's still going. Did I stop him? I think so. We might notice that he only showed one thing on his axis, which is lifespan, and there are a lot of other things that one can measure, and income. I'm sorry, those were the two. But he summarizes the extraordinary progress and growth. As I'm sure everyone in this audience knows, that has come at great cost to the environment. And so one of the things that we do early on in the class is try to get a sense for just how unique the place that we're in, historically speaking, is. So we look at the incredible growth and the kind of things that Hans Rosling points to. And then we also look at the taxing of our environmental and social systems that have resulted from all that growth.
soap, industrially produced soap, we got piped water, and we got some medical actions, you know. And instead of 4 dying,
Do you want to help me?
4 survived
I
and
don't
2
need
died.
more, so.
And that caused the growth of the population. You see, 2 parents, 4 children, doubling in 1 generation. 25 years, 1 billion.
Be
2
quiet,
billion.
Hans.
25 years more, 2 billion to 4 billion.
Where to go, where to go?
And there we went,
Is this, no.
to 7 billion people.
Yeah, there we go.
And this is
Thank you very much. Okay, so back here, and here. There we go. So, it's just here. I just saw them. Where'd they go? Drive, yeah. How do you get there? Oh, there you go. Perfect. Nope. No, you just had it. It was the, there we go. That, perfect. Actually, let's see, that's the faster. So one of the ways in which you can get a very quick visual of the environmental cost of all of that progress is with these series of graphs that have been produced and analyzed extensively. You can get these on the web and get good analysis very easily, called the Great Acceleration. And one of the things that really stands out is the degree to which the acceleration of the use of Earth resources corresponds almost exactly to the time period that Hans Rosling describes the progress. So the two together paint a picture of the degree to which our natural systems have been challenged or depleted. The acceleration shows most of the time the growth. And you can look at, for instance, let me click on one. There's the one for carbon dioxide emissions. So Elizabeth Kolbert is a scholar who has popularized the idea and actually has a series of books and things written called The Sixth Mass Extinction. But one of the things that we work with in the class is, as I said, trying to capture the utter uniqueness of the current historical moment. So we have, on the one hand, immense progress around human health, longer lifespans and income. On the other hand, immense using of resources to the point that we have crossed what are referred to as planetary boundaries. We've crossed 7 out of 9 of them. One of the concepts that we work with early in the class is this concept of we are the asteroid. And this captures the idea that if geographers 1,000 or 2,000 years from now were to look back at our time period, they would notice change such that it would actually show up in the geological record as a band of what you might call sort of sudden and planetary-wide change. And the 3 elements that geologists say will show up thousands of years from now, if there are any geologists around to look, are these 3 right here, which is the climate warming as a result of carbon emissions that will show up in the record. What's referred to as the 6th mass extinction, which is the extinction that we are in the middle of right now. And human activity is causing an extinction rate currently, which is about 1,000 times the natural rate of extinction. The last mass extinction were the poor dinosaurs. That's why the visual is there. And then the other thing that will show up in the geological record is ocean acidification. So what I tried to do in the class, to have students Is that on? There we go. Oh, it's a little loud still. Apologies for the technological glitches here. But we try to grapple with the idea of humans being agents of geological change. Because if we're in the process of ushering a new geological era, then that's something that we have to grapple with as part of what it means to be human right now. And the human species has never ushered in a geological era before. We have never seen the rate of change and the extent of change to natural systems in the time of our time as a species. It's a tricky concept in the sense that, as you know, different parts of humanity are more responsible for the aspects of the change than others. And so it's primarily the industrialized and wealthy nations and those who consume the most in them who are the most responsible, and the global south and the developing nations, as well as those who have less access to resources, so less ability to consume, who are less responsible. So there are varying degrees of responsibility, but we begin our course by wrestling with this question. And inevitably, students ask, as I said, oops, are we still not slideshow? Hold on, let me look and see. I don't know why it's not showing. Oh, well, you can see all the slides. How did we get here and what can we do about it? So I wanted to show you in the first unit of the class, in the first days of class, as we wrestle with this information, the students produce questions on the spot. I asked them, so what are your live questions as you think about our environmental responsibility, and if you think about the Anthropocene, as you think about climate change, what are your live questions that have a historical dimension to them? And they type them into a Google Doc, and they essentially provide our syllabus for the semester. I use them as guiding questions for the whole semester long. And I wanted to share a few of them with you as we begin to think about this together. How does deep social change happen? How do evolutionary leaps happen? How do individuals change? How do we change systems? Where did capitalism come from? Where do our cultural values come from? Are hate and greed part of human nature? Why do we continue to use so much when we know it's more than our appropriate share? What resources will we draw on in the face of catastrophe? Is inequality permanent? How can we build resilience for human and natural communities? And finally, what is worth sustaining? What are we trying to save? And that's just a sampling. And as you can tell, of the questions, they vary a little bit, although I'll say most of these show up most semesters I teach this class. As you can tell, these are big questions with not easy answers. And I think that one of the things that I encourage all of us to do is to acknowledge the bigness of the questions and to try to think about the kind of resources that we have as human beings to grapple with those questions. And just for folks who want to see this, I teach a variety of different kinds of texts, including this one, which is an environmental ethics book, this one, which is an environmental history book. I also use a book on the Little Ice Age by Jeffrey Parker that describes how human response was to climate change in the 17th century. And then I also use fiction. And the last thing I just wanted to say about the framing of the class is that I also teach these classes, or these texts. When I took Western Civ as a student at Willamette University, I had Professor Bill Duvall, and he used a great books approach in the Western Civ curriculum, and I really wanted to keep that. And so I usually teach a combination of these great books, and what we do is we take our live questions and our questions from the contemporary context, and we go back and look at these classic books and read them anew and afresh to see what answers they have. So what I wanted to do today is to share just three of my reflections that have come as a result of cross-pollinating all these disciplines and asking these questions, and ask you to think about them too as we move into question and answer and discussion. And one of my big takeaways from teaching this class is that when you tell a story, it matters a lot where you begin. And you know this. If someone were to ask you to tell me the story of your life, oftentimes you begin with where you're born, your family, perhaps you go back a generation or two. A Western Civ textbook, a standard telling of how we began, begins usually sometimes with like a half of a page on hunter-gatherers, and then jumps right into discovery of agriculture and the taking off of civilization. In this course, I begin with the Big Bang. And we actually spent a lot of time in deep evolutionary history. And the idea is to begin to ask students to think about themselves as a species among other species that has co-evolved with natural systems throughout our species history. So we begin by asking ourselves, and what patterns do we share with other species in evolution? How are we different? So we study, I actually have usually an evolutionary biologist come as a guest to the class, and we read some deep evolutionary biology. And one of the things that happens is that it really challenges students' notion of what it even means to be human. And I oftentimes have remarks like this made in papers. What if we challenge where human begins? A narrative of humans that includes the beginning of life itself, from the first cells, through the mass extinction of the dinosaurs to our current state, could prompt a greater appreciation of our role in a global interspecies community. awe at the unlikely coincidences that got us here, and compassion for fellow species who have traveled the bumpy road of evolution and thrived alongside of us. It's a good paper. That was a good paper. That got an A, that paper did. So after this first unit, most students come away with the notion of, I've never thought about a species history, that in order to understand where we are today, I need to understand a species history. And as a result, they have essentially a new character in the story for human, and also a new plot line. It becomes less about human mastery over nature and the inevitability of civilization, and more as participating in a millennia-long process of communication with other species. So they come up with this character, essentially, of the human as one species among any, co-evolving with and dependent on natural systems. And one of the things we spent a lot of time on is the 99% of our history that's prior to agriculture. 99% of our genetic history as humans was spent in the hunter-gatherer stage. And we look at the impacts in the environment then, and a lot of people have the impression that human impact in the environment really was only significant starting in the industrial age. But increasingly, we know that in every continent, in every space, human impact in the environment through fire, deforestation, and use of resources was widespread from a very early time period and very significant. So they sort of lose the myth of nature as this pristine backdrop, which we only really began messing up in 1800. And we begin to find out the ways in which human beings mimic other organisms in terms of evolutionary development, in terms of the ability to communicate. Human systems evidence ever greater complexity and ever greater energy use, just like the bacteria before us. But we use symbols with great sophistication in order to communicate. We have adapted to every single biome on the planet, and the sheer biomass in terms of population makes us utterly unusual. So the picture of the human as sort of the inevitable civilized agriculturalist fades away, and instead we have this. And the second point that I've reflected on is this idea, which is that a new periodization leads to a new story. And periodization is a fancy word historians use to say how we chop up time. And I imagine if I asked you if you remember your Western Civ class, it would look something like this. Maybe you talked about the Paleolithic era or the Neolithic era. The storyline is there's a first human species and their use of fire and agriculture, but the real action starts with invention of writing. And then in the ancient age, then right before the Middle Ages, there's the fall of Rome. How many people spent a lot of time on the fall of Rome in Western Civ? We spent a lot of time on that. And then Columbus discovered America. We have the ushering of the modern age and the age of democratic revolutions, most noticeably the French Revolution. And so in this class, we discover together a different kind of way of chopping things up into periods. And we actually don't use this one that's so familiar. It's not exactly arbitrary, but it was made by historians for a series of reasons to tell a story. And it actually really doesn't help us tell the story of the present very much if we're really interested in thinking about climate change. So they're given a variety of choices, but I think one of the more compelling ones they land on is a timeline suggested by Edmund Burke, which is much simpler. And he suggests that what really matters is in human history, we've had two energy regimes. The solar and renewable energy regime, which he also calls the somatic or bodily energy regime, and the fossil fuel and the non-renewable energy regime. So his argument, and the students oftentimes use this in their papers, is that we really ought to see these energy regimes, we ought to divide it up into the fact that we have from 2.5 million years ago to about 10,000 BCE, we have the use of fire. And then from about 10,000 to 1800, the dominant thing to talk about is agriculture. And the name of the game during this entire time of the solar renewable energy regime is how to control and mobilize bodies, human and animal. how it is you got power and did what you wanted to do was to be able to mobilize bodies to do everything from build cities, to build pyramids, to fight wars, to farm countries for you. And the fossil fuel regime, he divides into two different parts, the first with coal and steam, the second with oil and gas, where the name of the game becomes extraction of resources and operates on a transnational or global scale. And this becomes even more meaningful if we think about world energy consumption. And one of the reasons to tell the story in terms of energy is that we have consumed more energy in the last 100 years than in all the millions of years of human history prior to that together. And there are a lot of different graphs. You can see this is a nice one of world per capita annual primary energy consumption that also traces essentially the same time period that Hans Rosling did in his video. So we can see in some ways why life expectancy and why per capita income increases if we make a correlation between energy use. It's much more complicated than that, and I spent a lot of time with it. We spent a couple days on that in my class, but you get the gist of it. You also get the gist of it if you look at a population graph, which I'm sure you have seen. So students conclude that if we want to tell a story that captures what's unique about the present, we need to rethink things as basic as the standard way we chop up time. Instead of agricultural revolution, classical Greece, Roman Empire, Dark Ages, Renaissance, Industrial Revolution, the human story ought to be told in terms of energy regimes, the solar energy regime and the fossil fuel energy regime. And I won't take the time to go into all the detail here, but I'm happy to take questions. I just wanted to click through the periodization or the way in our class that we have reorganized thinking about the past. So as I mentioned, we start with the Big Bang, and we do deep evolutionary history and the use of fire. We spend quite a bit of time on hunter-gatherers and indigenous land management. The transition to agriculture turns out to be huge, and we spent a lot of time on it because, as you probably know, with surplus food, you have non-food producing specialists, and then like politicians and religious leaders and military leaders, and increased hierarchy and increased population density and increased inequity. So a lot of the problems that we wrestle with today, we've had since the time of the agricultural revolution. We descend into the Mediterranean era, and particularly to classical Greece and to Athens, primarily because we happen to live in a country as a democracy, and we spend time asking ourselves, what is the relevance of that political institution today? And so we read both those who critique it, as well as those who celebrate it. And then we skip right over the rise and fall of Rome, even though that's actually a topic somewhat near and dear to my heart. And we go to the rise of capitalism, which is actually in the late Middle Ages. And we look at alternatives and resistance to capitalism. We look at the Franciscans in particular, but to tell the story that capitalism, the transition to a market economy, was not inevitable, nor was it received without a considerable amount of cultural conflict and difficulty. And then we explore the concept of limitlessness and our addiction to limitlessness as we think about the never-ending frontier and colonial expansion. And we spend quite a bit of time with Little Ice Age. That book that I showed you, Geoffrey Parker, he looks at the Little Ice Age, which is, there are two high points of it, one in the 17th century, one in the 18th century. And his argument in the book is to show that the way climate disrupts food production, produces famine, which produces an immense amount of civil unrest. And so Thomas Hobbes' famous statement of life being nasty, poor, brutish, and short, which he was a political philosopher who wrote about the 17th century and wrote in it, it was true. Life was nasty, poor, brutish, and short. There's an immense amount of warfare, immense amount of famine. And Parker's argument is that the elements of the modern state arise out of the ashes of these revolutions. This notion that we ought to take care of our people was primarily developed by elites who were anxious for more peace. So we study how disruptions in climate disrupt food and then lead to lead to human suffering. And then I finish, and this is my last point, which is that in order to understand what it means to be human right now, I believe we have to be looking into the future. So I end the course with this book, which is by Eric Conway and Naomi Oreskes. And Naomi Oreskes was our Dempsey lecturer last year, and perhaps many of you heard her. It's a novel that is set in 2393. It is set in New Seoul, because Old Seoul is underwater. And it is of a historian looking back at our age, and it assumes a business as usual projection, as in we haven't really done anything to mitigate climate change. We have not even tried to meet the Paris Agreement. So business as usual, not meeting Paris. And it asked the question of how is it that we got to the point of letting the climate run out of control. And so it analyzes the present from the perspective of the future. And I wanted to close before we open it up for discussion with just some quotes from some students that kind of suggest the degree to which this kind of reframing of the story invites them to rethink their suppositions and their assumptions. So here's one. Western civilization is far from monolithic. Human behavior is more complex and adaptive than those who focus on contemporary culture often allow. A definition of what it means to be human must once again include limits on our desires, and in so doing undermine the prefiguration that our history is bifurcated into the modern secular and classical spiritual worlds. This is not an appeal to coercion, but to discipline as an embedded part of the human experience. In light of sustainability, an honest history would avoid the tendency to totalize human evolutionary processes and would permit us to embrace new notions about what it means to be human. It would challenge the master narrative of a single determinist trajectory of human evolution that has led inevitably to civilization and modernity as we understand it today. It would account for the co-evolutionary processes between humans, our cosmological beginnings, and our ecological surroundings. Some of the comments are a rethinking of specific moments, in this case, the Neolithic transformation, which is the move from hunter-gatherer to agriculture. The Neolithic transformation created the possibility and capacity for such new knowledge as property, ownership, and inequality. The Neolithic era is a radically new framework for interpreting the world. Like others, it has its limits, but the fact that we negotiated this transformation holds forth hope for others of equal enormity. Here's one about, we read Plato's Phaedrus and Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War in the class. The question that arises from Plato's Phaedrus and Thucydides' critique of Athens and its democracy in the history of the Peloponnesian Wars is, can a democracy set its own limits? Understood in this way, sustainability is an active process of discovering new creative ways of adapting to different and complex sets of circumstances. It engages our adaptive and creative capacities in ways that make us more resilient, not vulnerable to change. So the course ends with a unit of thinking about what we mean by resilience after watching this long sweep of human history and thinking about the unique historical situation we are in right now in relationship to the climate and in relationship to the planet. Students are at the end, the last assignment from which some of these were drawn is to tell the history of humanity. It's a small assignment. They have 2 pages. I forced them, actually, I think they only have 5 pages to it, to try to craft their own story and to be aware of the ways in which how they tell the story shapes the window of our notion of our possibility to act in the present. So that's what I prepared, and I think we have a nice long time for question, answer, and more discussion. And I think you pass a mic around, is that true? Yes. Yes, and I think that your hand went up first right over here. Or right here. Thank you. Okay.
So my question to you is, how do you respond to people that challenge you and call your assumptions and teaching even false or fake news? and who do not believe anything you say? How do you respond? How do you defend what you're teaching?
Well, thankfully, that doesn't happen at Willamette. So I have no students who do that. So that's not something that happens in the classroom. And actually, it doesn't happen too often in what I might call the regular world. But I do, in the few instances in which it has happened, which have included family members, distant family members, I have a lot of facts at the ready for them. So I refer them to a series of websites and easy to access information. And one of my attitudes is that they can make sense of it if they want to. One of the things Peter started out quoting how many people believe in climate change or not, which I don't know where your stats came from, but the Yale Climate Connections has done a lot of research on this. And I don't know if you know this, but over 70% of the people and citizens of the United States believe, it's not something you believe in, but affirm that climate change has human causes. And it's actually a very small percentage. You cited 15% of conservative Republicans, but it's actually 12% of the population that are basically in the camp of they're not going to listen to anything you say. And then there's quite a few people in the middle who think, yeah, this is a problem, but they don't really know what to do about it. In other words, they're not in the camp of denying the facts. They're just more in the camp of not understanding the implications or what it ought to mean in terms of policy. So a lot of climate activism has shifted from trying to talk to the kind of people you're describing and trying to convince them, and instead to talk to this large group in the middle that agree with a few of the basic assumptions and are amenable to understanding what we might want to do about it. And I think that's a really good use of time. So, great question, though. Yeah.
In the context of sustainability, how do you deal with such things as human population growth and wealth disparity?
That's a nice small question. So tell me a little bit more about why you asked that question.
Because I see both of them as problematic for our future.
Yes, I agree. How I deal with it in the classroom is I invite students to see the range of responses we might have to that. For instance, the problem of population. One thing we do in the class, which I didn't mention at all, in addition to teaching history, I also teach food justice. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about food systems globally. And so one of the things that we do in the course is and part of the Transition to Agriculture unit, we address the question, is there enough food to feed the population of the world now? And the answer is yes, there is. Will there be in 2050? Yes. It's a distribution problem. The question of what types of food are most harmful to the environment, which include mostly animals and animal products, is a different question, and how it is that you get people to choose a diet that is the least environmentally destructive is an issue. But the real issue, they realize, has to do with is a political problem and a problem of the will. So we spend a lot of time when we're reading people like Thucydides and Plato and other people asking ourselves, so what is it that would change individuals and systems such that we could deal with feeding a population in a way that was environmentally sustainable for the planet? And we read a variety of opinions about whether that's possible or not and what ways we can do that. So in other words, I see them as live questions. As the question you asked to me opens up 50 more questions, which are worth pursuing. And they're central, but they're not questions that shut down the conversation. They're questions to me that open the conversation. Oh, sorry, microphone right there. Go. Yes.
Oh, am I next? Okay. This is Irene, and I want to say that very few years ago, we here at ICL did over a period of 2 years a course called Big History.
Oh, you did?
Which was...
Oh, that's great. I use that word. I use Bill Christian.
It was started in the Big Bang.
Yeah.
And I have to say that of all the things we've studied, that was the most eye-opening and such a wonderful thing. We did it over a course of 2 years, and
I didn't realize you'd done that.
We'd have the lecture followed by our own input by a member. It was really fantastic. My question is, do most universities take this approach like what you're doing here, which seems so important for modern students? Do most universities do that?
No,
Oh dear.
no. It's actually somewhat rare, which is why I gave a paper on it. Environmental History Journal reached out and asked if I published for them, because there are not that many people who have taken this approach. Certainly you find increasingly environmental history as a discipline has increasing prominence in the university. But the blend of green history, eco-history, interdisciplinary history, and activist history that I do is not as common, particularly dealing with these questions. So there are other ways people get at it. One of the things that stood out to me from those quotes, however, is that most of the students in my class have taken a lot of classes that have focused on the last 50 to 150 years. So they have a really good idea of that time period. And I think that that's an important thing to have, and I teach in that era as well. But the thing about this and your exploration of Dibble Christian's work is there's a perspective that comes with the deep time that you can't get. And I'm really struck by the fact that the majority of students emerge with a sense of urgency, but also hopefulness about human adaptability. When you watch organisms and humans adapt and co-evolve over thousands of years, the present moment feels like, well, let's adapt. So you start thinking about, well, what systems are working and not, as opposed to just going to, it's all going to hell in a handbasket and let's just give up. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay, somebody else has a microphone. I can't see. There.
Yeah, my name is David. I've been coming to this for 17 years now, and one of the most enjoyable parts of this, which I would like to see more of, is interaction.
Yeah, so that comment was about the need for in media coverage of climate change, making sure you realize that it's or that we add human-induced climate change, because you note that even the small people who don't believe in climate change are happy to talk about climate change in the past, but don't believe that our current burning of carbon is contributing to the rapid rise in CO2 emissions, and usually also don't believe that there is any harm with that. So I agree. That would be helpful. I think it's a question of just editing. Yeah, so that was the comment about climate refugees. And there are certainly, that is perhaps will be one of the most noticeable impacts of a changing climate, will be people having to migrate as a result of climate disasters or the inhabitability of environments. And that is something that happens in the 17th century for sure, but it's going to happen a lot more now in our lives. And actually, one of the things we do is read an analysis of the Syrian conflict, which takes into account the role of climate and famine in that conflict. It's certainly not the only aspect of that conflict, but it was I think, a more determinant aspect than others, or at least as much as others. And so thinking about the Syrian refugee crisis as a climate-driven or climate-caused in part, migration is certainly a useful and good thing to do. If you just think about the havoc that was wreaked with Hurricane Harvey and the amount of movement of human bodies, and you begin to think about climate disrupting not only cities along where sea level rises, but also cities that are hit by unusually large and forceful storms of various sorts, or in the West, unusually long and violent seasons of wildfire. You can begin to imagine the climate migration or the issue around migration, and that is a huge issue. People talk about what you see. People talk all about sea level rise, but in fact, the disruption to food systems and the climate refugee are, if you look at any climate action plan, those are the two things that are worrying people the most for the foreseeable future.
Okay, my name is Bob. Don't hold the mic so close, Bob.
Okay.
I just demonstrated reflexivity, and my question relates to reflexivity. Have any of your students grappled with the idea that we're the only species that I know of that is self-aware of itself as a species, that has a sense of historical consciousness, and is failing for the moment, but attempting to regulate its effect on the ecosystem? The anaerobic bacteria didn't have any of that,
Right.
and they destroyed everything else.
Yeah, this is where I get to jump up and down and say, yes! That's the entire underpinning of my approach, is that we can do this thing called reflection. We have this capacity. It's an incredibly powerful tool, and it can be used. And one of the ways that we do it is exactly, as you said, through memory and remembering and understanding the past in order to understand what we ought to do in the present. So we do. We especially spend time with that when we read Plato. Yeah.
We have time for one more question, and I think someone here had their hand up. No?
Oh, sorry, okay.
This is Hans. Are there any population groups left besides some of the African Bushmen or the Sin that still live in a sustainable manner?
That's a good question and a complicated one. It's one that students usually ask. So one of the primary things that we do in the course is get rid of the idea that there once were a lot of human populations that lived in sustainable manners, and only modern European industrial man did not. So we watch civilizations. You maybe have read Jared Diamond's book, Collapse. So watching civilizations rise and fall, including, not in that book, but in the articles that I teach, what we might call indigenous or hunter-gatherer civilizations. One of the things we spend a lot of time on is the civilization that lived on the coast of Oregon for 2,000 years. Of stability before the European contact. And so the question I'm most interested in is, if you look at that civilization, how it sustained itself, is what were the mechanisms of limits to power and limits to ecosystem overuse that kept it going? And so there are examples like that from the present and the past where we can discern a series of principles for how it is we might want to design resilient and long-lasting systems today. And in fact, Native and Indigenous tribes and recent research is one of the most fertile areas to see systems that have worked in the past. And it's not as simple as there were a lot of fish or an absence of conflict. In fact, there was a lot of conflict, and the land and the fishing systems were extensively managed, but they were managed for abundance rather than scarcity. So for me, a real central question is, how do we manage for abundance rather than scarcity? Okay, thank you.